Dear learners, welcome back to WSE English Story, where learning English becomes more than just a lesson, it becomes an unforgettable adventure. Here, history comes alive, not only in words, but also in feelings, images, and lessons that can guide your own journey in life. Today, we are going to step into the footsteps of a young man from Venice whose name still echoes across centuries. Marco Polo. To many, he was just a traveler. But to those who look closer, he was a bridge between two great worlds, a man who opened Asia to Europe. His life was not only about reaching faraway lands. It was about courage, patience, and the endless curiosity to discover what lies beyond the horizon. This is not just the story of a man. It is the story of a journey that changed history. As you listen, you will improve your English, but you will also discover a powerful lesson, how one person's determination can shape the destiny of many. Before we dive in, if you'd like to support our work, you are welcome to like, comment, share, or subscribe. Your support means a lot and helps us continue creating stories that truly matter. So get ready for mystery, conflict, courage, and discovery. Get ready to be inspired by the life of Marco Polo, the man who opened Asia to Europe. Let's begin this extraordinary journey together. To understand Marco Polo's greatness, we must first understand the world into which he was born. The year was 1254, and his birthplace was Venice, a city unlike any other in medieval Europe. Imagine narrow canals instead of streets, marble palaces rising from the water, and ships returning from distant seas filled with spices, silk, and jewels. Venice was alive with trade, ambition, and the sound of coins clinking in merchants' hands. For a boy growing up here, the idea of travel was not just a dream. It was part of daily life. Marco's family belonged to this merchant world. His father, Niccolò, and his uncle, Maffeo, were seasoned traders who had already dared to travel far beyond the Mediterranean. They were men of vision, always searching for new opportunities. But when Marco was still a young child, his mother died, and his father was away on a long journey. The boy was left in the care of relatives, growing up with the absence of a parent, learning early that life was uncertain and often lonely. Europe itself was restless during this time. Kingdoms fought for power, and the shadow of the Crusades still lingered. Yet, far to the east, a new force was rising, the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan, grandson of the fearsome Genghis Khan. His empire stretched across vast lands, covering much of Asia. For Europeans, Asia was still a mystery, filled with legends of golden cities, wise rulers, and treasures beyond imagination. Few had ever seen it. The Silk Road, a long and dangerous network of trade routes, connected Europe with Asia. Along these roads, merchants, scholars, and adventurers carried not only goods but also stories, religions, and ideas. However, the journey was filled with danger, deserts with no water, mountains covered in snow, and bandits waiting to strike. Few dared to attempt it. Yet, this was the world Marco Polo inherited, a Venice full of energy, a family deeply tied to trade, and a mysterious East waiting to be discovered. As Marco grew, he absorbed the spirit of his city, ambition, curiosity, and resilience. He heard tales of distant lands, of spices that could preserve food, of silk so soft it felt like water, and of rulers whose power stretched across continents. These stories must have burned inside him like sparks waiting to become a fire. But every great story begins not only with opportunity but also with absence, loss, and longing. Marco Polo's childhood, marked by the absence of his father and the death of his mother, planted in him a quiet strength. It was the silence before the storm, the preparation before destiny would call. And soon, that call would come. Every journey begins with a problem, and for young Marco Polo, that problem was not just the loss of his mother but the long absence of his father. While other boys saw their fathers teach them business, guide them in life, or stand by them in moments of trouble, Marco grew up with stories of a man who was always far away, risking his life on the dangerous roads to Asia. For a child, this absence could easily turn into bitterness. Why had his father chosen distant lands over his own son? Why were treasures and trade more important than family? These questions must have haunted Marco as he watched other families live together in Venice. Yet instead of breaking him, the absence created something else, a deep hunger. A hunger to know where his father had gone, what he had seen, and why the world beyond Venice had such a powerful pull. Venice itself was full of contrasts. On one side, wealth glittered in palaces and churches. On the other, disease, poverty, and danger lurked in the narrow streets. Marco saw both sides and learned early that life was uncertain, fragile, and often unfair. This awareness shaped his spirit. He realized that to survive and to rise, one needed courage, knowledge, and the ability to face hardship. When Marco was still in his teens, a fateful event occurred. His father and uncle returned to Venice after years away. They had traveled deep into Asia, even reaching the court of Kublai Khan, the great Mongol ruler. They returned with stories of a world so vast and rich that few could even imagine it. They spoke of cities with stone towers that touched the sky, of golden palaces, and of a ruler whose empire was larger than all the kingdoms of Europe combined. For Marco, this was both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling because he finally had a chance to connect with his father through shared adventure. Terrifying because it meant facing dangers he had only heard of in whispers, deserts without water, mountains where the air was too thin to breathe, seas where storms could swallow ships in an instant. This was the first great challenge in Marco's life, the choice between comfort and risk. He could remain in Venice, live a safe life as a merchant, and perhaps build a quiet fortune. Or he could join his father and uncle on a journey that might never end, through lands that few Europeans had ever survived. And there was another challenge, a silent one that few noticed. Marco was young and inexperienced. He was not yet a seasoned merchant, nor a trained explorer. The thought of leaving behind everything familiar, his friends, his home, the city of Venice itself, must have filled him with fear. But within that fear lay the seed of transformation. Have you ever faced such a moment yourself? A choice between staying safe in the world you know, or stepping into the unknown with no guarantee of success. It is in such moments that our lives are shaped. Marco Polo, still only a young man, stood on the edge of such a decision. Soon, he would make his choice, and history would never be the same. The decision was made. Marco Polo, barely 17, would leave Venice with his father Niccolò and his uncle Maffeo. For most young men his age, life was just beginning in familiar streets, filled with friends, markets, and dreams of marriage. For Marco, life was about to begin on the endless road eastward, a road filled with uncertainty. In 1271, the three Polos set out. Their destination was not just a city, not even a single country, but the court of the mighty Kublai Khan in distant China. No European boy had ever gone so far. For Marco, every step was both a discovery and a trial. The first struggles came quickly. Crossing the Mediterranean was dangerous enough, with storms threatening to swallow fragile ships. But once they reached the land routes, the real test began. The caravan had to pass through deserts where the sun turned the sand into burning glass. Days could pass without water, and sometimes travelers heard strange sounds in the desert, like voices calling them into the dunes, illusions caused by exhaustion and fear. For Marco, this was not just physical hardship, it was a battle of the mind. To survive, he had to learn patience, silence, and resilience. Then came the mountains. The Pamirs, so high that Marco wrote the fire would not burn properly because the air was too thin. Imagine a young Venetian boy, used to sea breezes and city streets, now gasping for breath in the freezing heights of mountains taller than anything he had ever imagined. Each step must have felt like walking on the edge of the sky. Along the way, Marco encountered cultures he had never known. In Armenia, Persia, and Afghanistan, he saw cities built of stone, mosques filled with prayers, and markets full of goods unlike those in Venice. At first, he must have felt like an outsider, lost in a world of strange languages and unfamiliar customs. But instead of closing himself off, Marco listened, observed, and learned. Slowly, he began to pick up languages and to understand the way people thought. This ability to adapt, to see with open eyes and an open heart, would later become his greatest strength. The struggle was not only external. Inside, Marco wrestled with doubt. Would they ever reach China? Would he even live to see Venice again? His father and uncle were experienced traders, hardened by years of travel. Marco was still learning. Every illness, every cold night in the desert, every whisper of bandits hiding in the shadows tested his spirit. And yet, he endured. There is one powerful lesson here. The world often rewards those who are willing to step outside their comfort zone, who endure hardship not because they are fearless, but because their curiosity and hope are stronger than their fear. Marco was no longer just a boy following his father. He was becoming a traveler, a learner, and a man shaped by the road itself. After years of travel, facing bandits, storms, hunger, and exhaustion, the Polos finally reached the court of Kublai Khan in China. For Marco, this moment must have been overwhelming. Before him stood a ruler who commanded one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. The journey that began as a trial had now brought him to the very heart of power. But this was not the end of struggle. In fact, it was only the beginning. Marco Polo was about to step into a world of politics, culture, and power games far more complex than any desert storm or mountain pass. His greatest challenges were still to come. When Marco Polo first entered the court of Kublai Khan, he must have felt as if he had stepped into another world. The Khan's palace at Xanadu, known in Europe as Xanadu, was unlike anything Venice had ever shown him. Walls painted in brilliant colors, gardens filled with rare animals, halls where the air itself seemed heavy with the scent of spices and incense. The empire was rich, vast, and organized in ways that astonished Europeans. For Marco, this was more than just a spectacle. It was a test. The Mongol court did not simply welcome foreigners. Trust had to be earned. And here began the great turning point of his life. At first, Marco was only the son of Venetian merchants, an outsider in a world where loyalty was everything. But he had something rare: curiosity, adaptability, and the ability to learn quickly. While others hesitated, Marco threw himself into learning the language, studying customs, and observing carefully. Slowly, Kublai Khan began to notice this young foreigner with bright eyes and an attentive mind. The real breakthrough came when Marco demonstrated not only knowledge but also loyalty. Kublai Khan tested him, sending him on missions across the empire. Some were political, visiting distant provinces, observing governors, bringing back reports. Others were diplomatic, representing the Khan's interests with people of other faiths and nations. Imagine the courage required, a young European, barely in his 20s, riding for weeks across dangerous lands, entrusted with messages that could decide the fate of entire provinces. And yet, Marco succeeded again and again. The Khan grew to trust him, and Marco rose from being a mere traveler to a respected advisor. This was the turning point. He was no longer just Marco Polo's son or a young Venetian adventurer. He was a man who carried the voice of the Khan himself. Few foreigners had ever reached such a position of honor in the Mongol court. But this turning point was not only about trust. It was about transformation. Marco had begun as a boy curious about the world, unsure of his place in it. Now, he had become a bridge between East and West, between two worlds that barely understood each other. This rise also brought conflict. The more trusted Marco became, the more dangerous his life was. Enemies watched him, suspicious of this foreigner gaining influence. Failure in one mission could mean disgrace or even death. Every report he gave, every decision he made carried weight. And there was the personal struggle. Marco was still far from Venice, far from home. The years were passing. What if he never returned? What if he became a man lost between two worlds, belonging to neither fully? The thought must have haunted him even as he stood in the glittering halls of Xanadu. Here lies the turning point of his story. He could have chosen safety, remained a passive guest at the court, lived quietly, and avoided risk. Instead, he embraced the challenge, accepted missions that carried great danger, and allowed himself to grow into something larger than his own fears. This is where history itself shifted. Through Marco's eyes, Europe would later learn of China's vast cities, its postal system, its paper money, its canals and bridges, its advanced agriculture, and its unimaginable wealth. He was not simply traveling, he was witnessing the achievements of an empire and preparing to carry those stories back to the West. Turning points often come when we least expect them, in moments when trust is offered, when responsibility is placed on our shoulders, when fear whispers that we cannot succeed. Marco Polo, in that distant court, chose to rise. And in doing so, he stepped from the shadows of his father's name into his own destiny. The young Venetian merchant was gone. In his place stood a man who would change the way the world saw itself. Years passed in the service of Kublai Khan. Marco Polo was no longer the young boy who had set out from Venice. He was a man, hardened by deserts and mountains, sharpened by diplomacy, trusted by one of the most powerful rulers the world had ever seen. He had seen wonders that no European could have imagined, cities with millions of people, canals stretching like rivers across the land, markets overflowing with silk, spices, and porcelain. Yet, as the years turned into decades, another reality weighed heavily on Marco's heart. Home. Venice. The family and life he had left behind. His father and uncle felt it too. They were honored at the Khan's court, but they were also strangers in a foreign land. They could not stay forever. They longed to return. But leaving was not simple. Kublai Khan, by now deeply attached to Marco and his family, did not want to let them go. They were valuable to him, eyes and ears he could trust, advisors he could rely on. Asking to leave was dangerous. To refuse the Khan was to risk his anger. And yet to remain meant abandoning their homeland forever. This was the heart of Marco's conflict, loyalty versus freedom, duty versus desire. He had gained everything in Asia: honor, wisdom, experience, but at the cost of his youth and his connection to his homeland. How much longer could he serve before he lost himself completely? Then fate intervened. A Mongol princess was to be married to a Persian prince. The Khan needed trusted envoys to escort her safely across seas and hostile lands. It was a perilous mission, but it offered the Polos a way out. They could accompany the princess and, from Persia, make their way back to Venice. This was Marco's moment of choice. Stay in the East, continue serving the Khan, and live with power but without home. Or take the dangerous road westward, knowing that storms, pirates, and bandits could destroy them before they ever saw Venice again. The decision carried sacrifice. By leaving, Marco risked losing the favor of Kublai Khan, the man who had raised him to honor. He risked betrayal on the road, death at sea, and the loss of all he had gained. Yet by staying, he risked something even greater: the chance to ever return home, to see his own land, to share what he had witnessed with the world. It was not only a geographical journey. It was a journey of the soul. Marco had to ask himself, who am I now? Am I a Venetian, a son of Europe? Or am I a servant of the Khan, bound to a foreign empire for life? With courage, the Polos chose the road home. They joined the fleet escorting the princess, sailing across stormy waters, through lands filled with danger. Many ships sank. Many travelers died. Only a fraction of the expedition survived. Yet against all odds, Marco, his father, and his uncle lived. When they finally returned to Venice, nearly 24 years had passed since they had first left. Marco was no longer a boy but a man in his 40s. The city he had left as a youth no longer recognized him. Even his relatives doubted that he was who he claimed to be. It was as if he had become a man divided between two worlds, too eastern for Venice, too western for Asia. But inside him burned the treasure of memory, the stories, the knowledge, the lessons of his long service. His sacrifice had been great, but his choice to return would change not only his own life, but also the imagination of Europe itself. And so, out of conflict and sacrifice, Marco Polo emerged ready to leave his mark on history, not with armies or kingdoms, but with words. When Marco Polo finally set foot once more on Venetian soil, his heart must have swelled with relief. Yet the return was bittersweet. 24 years had passed. The boy who had left was gone. In his place stood a man marked by the dust of deserts, the winds of oceans, and the weight of experience. Even his relatives hardly recognized him. At first, they doubted he was truly Marco Polo. Only when he opened his chests, filled with jewels, silks, and treasures from the East, did they begin to believe. But Marco's true wealth was not gold or silk. It was his knowledge, his memories, his vision of a world far greater than anyone in Venice could imagine. While others spoke of wars with Genoa, of rival merchants, of city politics, Marco spoke of lands where paper money replaced coins, of cities with canals larger than Venice itself, of rulers whose power stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe. Then fate placed him in yet another dramatic situation. Venice went to war with its rival, Genoa, and Marco was captured in battle. In prison, surrounded by soldiers and sailors, he began to tell his stories. Among those who listened was a writer named Rustic Hello de Pisa. He encouraged Marco to dictate his experiences. Together, they created what would become one of the most famous books of the Middle Ages, The Travels of Marco Polo. The book spread quickly, translated into many languages, carried across Europe like a spark of imagination. For the first time, Europeans read detailed accounts of China's great cities, its postal system, its roads, its wealth of silk and spices. Marco described the grandeur of Kublai Khan's court, the diversity of the empire, and the wonders of the lands he had crossed. Some readers believed every word, others thought it was fantasy. Yet whether believed or doubted, his stories ignited curiosity and longing. This was Marco Polo's great victory. He did not conquer with armies. He conquered with imagination. He expanded the mental map of Europe. His words became the bridge he had always been, connecting East and West, carrying ideas, dreams, and possibilities across continents. Centuries later, explorers like Christopher Columbus would carry a copy of the travels of Marco Polo as they set out to find new routes across the oceans. Merchants dreamed of reaching the golden cities Marco had described. Scholars and rulers began to see Asia not as myth but as reality. And yet, Marco's personal achievement was deeper. He had endured loss, exile, danger, and doubt. He had been tested in deserts and mountains, in the courts of emperors, and on storm-tossed seas. He had chosen the harder path, the uncertain path, and in the end, he had returned not empty-handed, but carrying treasures that no thief could steal: knowledge, wisdom, and resilience. Victory often looks different than we expect. For Marco Polo, it was not about wealth or titles. It was about leaving behind a story that would inspire generations. His life was proof that the greatest journeys are not measured only in miles, but in courage, in choices, and in the strength to carry hope through hardship. His achievements were not his alone. They belonged to the countless travelers after him who followed his path, to the dreamers who opened his book and saw a world beyond their own villages, and to us today, as we remember his story and find courage for our own journeys. Marco Polo had become immortal, not through power, but through the legacy of his words. As our journey with Marco Polo comes to an end, let us pause and reflect. What began as the story of a curious boy from Venice grew into the epic of a man who carried the spirit of exploration across continents. Marco Polo did not just travel. He connected worlds. He did not just survive. He persevered. And in doing so, he left us a legacy that continues to shine through the centuries. The first lesson we can learn from Marco Polo is curiosity. It was curiosity that led him to leave the safety of Venice and follow his father and uncle into the unknown. Curiosity pushed him to ask questions, to observe carefully, to remember details about cultures and peoples that no one in Europe had ever seen. Without curiosity, there is no discovery. Without discovery, there is no progress. In your own life, let curiosity be your compass. When you ask, when you seek, when you remain open to learning, you too expand the borders of your world. The second lesson is resilience. Marco faced deserts where the sun seemed merciless, mountains where snow blinded the path, and seas that threatened to swallow ships whole. He saw death, disease, and betrayal. Yet he kept going. His resilience reminds us that the road to achievement is never smooth. In life, you will face storms of your own, disappointments, failures, obstacles. Remember Marco's journey. Remember that resilience is not about never falling. It is about rising every time you fall. The third lesson is adaptability. In the court of Kublai Khan, Marco learned to serve with loyalty and skill. He adapted to new languages, customs, and expectations. He proved that true strength lies not in rigidness, but in flexibility. The world today is changing faster than ever before. To succeed, we must learn, adjust, and grow, just as Marco did in a world vastly different from his own. The fourth lesson is the power of storytelling. Marco Polo's greatest victory was not in wealth but in words. His stories traveled further than he ever did. They inspired, taught, and challenged generations. This teaches us that sharing your experiences, your truth, your vision, can create ripples far beyond what you can see. Each of us has a story worth telling. Do not be afraid to share yours. And finally, the fifth lesson is vision. Marco did not allow the limits of his time to define his dreams. He dared to imagine lands beyond the horizon, and in doing so, he expanded the imagination of an entire continent. Vision is what gives meaning to effort. It is what transforms ordinary steps into an extraordinary journey. Ask yourself, what is your vision? What dream calls you forward? When we look at Marco Polo's life, we see not just the story of one man but the reflection of the human spirit. The desire to seek. The courage to endure. The wisdom to adapt. The gift to inspire. These are not qualities of the past alone. They are qualities we can live by today. So as you continue your journey, whether in learning English, pursuing your career, or overcoming challenges, carry these lessons with you. Let curiosity lead you into new knowledge. Let resilience carry you through difficulties. Let adaptability keep you strong in change. Let your stories inspire others. And let vision give direction to everything you do. Marco Polo may have walked this earth 7 centuries ago, but his legacy speaks to us still. The world is vast, but so are the possibilities within you. Never forget that beyond every horizon lies not just a destination, but a discovery waiting to be made. Thank you for joining me on this adventure through history and language. If Marco Polo's story has inspired you, I invite you to like, comment, share, or subscribe. Your support helps us continue bringing the past to life in ways that enrich your future. And now, as we close this chapter, I leave you with this thought: the greatest journey is not always across deserts or oceans. Sometimes, it is the journey you take within, the journey of learning, of growing, of daring to dream. Like Marco Polo, may you find the courage to walk your own path and the wisdom to leave behind a legacy that endures. Dear learners, we have traveled together through deserts, crossed oceans, and stood in the halls of Kublai Khan with Marco Polo. But more than geography, this journey was about the courage to step beyond the familiar. Marco's story is not only a tale of one man, it is a reminder that human beings are capable of so much more than they imagine when they dare to follow the unknown path. Marco once said in his famous book, "I did not write half of what I saw, for I knew I would not be believed." These words carry more than historical weight. They remind us that life is richer, deeper, and more mysterious than our eyes can see, and sometimes even beyond what our words can capture. So let me ask you, what is the unknown road in your life right now? Is it learning a new skill, facing a challenge at school or work, or perhaps daring to dream of a future that seems out of reach? Remember Marco, a young man who chose the risk of adventure over the comfort of safety, and who left a legacy that shaped centuries. If Marco's journey inspired you, then share this story with others. Let it remind them, too, that courage, resilience, and vision can change the world. And if you'd like to support our work, please like, comment, subscribe, and share. Every gesture helps us continue to bring you stories that not only teach English but also touch the heart. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep dreaming. Goodbye for now.